If it exists, it can be taxed. And if it can be taxed, then a government is taxing it, will tax it, or has already tried to tax it. Austria once taxed yogurt, Antwerp used to tax brothel rooms, the Bashkirs used to tax eye colour. Grey eyes paid more, black eyes paid less. We're not sure what blue and green eyes cost, but the point is that as silly as it sounds, don't think the strangest taxes are behind us. Governments are always trying to think up new ways to tax things, whether it be for social change or economic vitality. Recently, the American government announced a wave of ideas to fix everything from low birth rates to balancing trade. Yet history shows us that plenty of rulers have tried to do that before, often with surprising results. And in times when a tax was controversial, a country would just find new ways to hide it. Take Argentina's tax on bachelors. If you were a young man in Buenos Aires at the start of the 20th century, then your lifestyle cost more. So if you thought that keeping a girlfriend happy is expensive, imagine how much cheaper it was than being single. The tax was created to encourage marriage and higher birth rates, not only to boost population, but also to boost the economy. It's a win-win, right? Unfortunately, one of the long-term side effects was an upswing in dysfunctional marriages. Couples rushed to get married, or stayed unhappier for longer, all because they wanted to escape the taxman. So long as a man could prove that he was at least trying to get married, then he wouldn't have to pay anything. But where there's a want or need, there's money to be made. An entire industry arose around helping bachelors skirt regulation. It was a rejection industry where, quote, professional lady rejectors would help bachelors to forge a dating history. Usually, a time limit was set where the hired woman consented to going to the theatre, eating ice cream, and accepting bouquets. Then, when he was summoned to the tax office, she'd go with him as a witness to back up his case. The crucial part was that his marriage proposal had to be rejected. But some women came from hardship and found it too tempting to accept an engagement ring from a wealthy client. More than likely, a bachelor originally planning to dodge tax might prefer going through with it than enduring the growing social stigma of singledom. Yet the tax was ridiculed, enforcing the tax was impractical, and exploitation was widespread. Eventually it was scrapped, but chances are Argentina was following in the footsteps of the USA and other Western countries by finding a smart way to present this new tax. Filing taxes with a spouse commonly means lower taxes for the household collectively. Essentially, getting married means lesser taxes than being a bachelor. That's probably why some politicians want to bring back strange taxes. Russian politicians have started calling for a reintroduction of the Soviet Union's childless tax. This differed from Argentina's tax on bachelors in fundamental ways. Firstly, it applied to any adult without kids, so single women weren't exempt. Next, it didn't care for your marital status at all, so being married without kids didn't help. Despite the tax being invented to encourage families, it was more important to breed than to have a wedding day. Unfortunately, it didn't matter if you couldn't have kids for a medical reason. Spinsters and young widows had their salaries garnished just like young working men. It was so strictly regulated that avoiding it was impossible. Forging a proposal to trick Argentinian authorities is less scary because there wasn't a South American gulag filled with enemies of the state who lied on their tax return. Still, it goes to show that governments will always find ways to tax people, and the people will always try to avoid it. Sometimes in the most unusual ways. It's time to learn how history works as we dig up history's strangest taxes and how to avoid them. This week's video is sponsored by Wild Grain. Wild Grain is the first bake from frozen subscription box offering artisanal sourdough breads, fresh pastas, and pastries. Their slow fermentation process makes sourdough that's easier on your belly, richer in nutrients, and even helps with blood sugar control, all without the hassle of baking it yourself. Everything goes from freezer to table in just 25 minutes, giving me homemade quality without the effort. I recently tried their giant chocolate chip cookies, and let me tell you, they are a game changer. Straight from the freezer, they bake up with the perfect balance of crispy edges and gooey centers. The aroma filled my kitchen, and honestly, they disappeared within minutes. They were that good. It's like having a bakery right in your home. Plus, Wild Grain supports the Greater Boston Food Bank, donating 4 meals for every new member. They also have new plant-based and gluten-free box options, so there's something for everyone. If you want to check out Wild Grain, be sure to click on my link in the description and use my code HISTORY to get $30 off your first box. plus a free item in every box. Taxes are great for encouraging or discouraging behaviours. That's why in 1698, Peter the Great, after returning from his secret trip to Europe, issued a tax on beards. He wanted to modernise Russia, so he started with outward appearances because the modern countries he admired weren't so big on facial hair. By taxing beards, he hoped to encourage men to shave them off. That way, he could chip away at traditionalist values to align himself with European powers. But conservative men didn't want to cut their bushy beards. Beards were a symbol of piety to them. Yet they soon became a symbol of wealth because only the rich could afford to pay the huge fines. So if you didn't want to comply with Peter the Great's not-so-great law, you either had to hide it while out in public or get a beard token. It was the only way to prove to authorities that you'd paid the tax, unless you bribed them, of course. When Peter the Great died, the tax faded away, though its cultural impact lingered for years. But one tax that lasted longer was England's tax on dice and playing cards. By 1684, 1.2 million packs of playing cards were being produced annually, which was a clear sign that the populace had become passionate about gambling. The government wanted to curb the activity among the lower classes, but they also needed a way to generate a war chest. So what's a simple way to encourage rich people to gamble but discourage poor people from it? In 1710, under the reign of Queen Anne, a huge tax was placed on playing cards and dice. Costs went as high as 2,300%. As you'd expect, production of cards went down because most people couldn't afford the markup. However, despite production being halved, the government made up to 8 times what it did previously, all thanks to the wealthy hobbyists. It was their sport now, but soon the lower echelons of society found a way to gamble. They turned to cheaper packs, being smuggled through the black market. Authorities had the impossible task of trying to tell the real ones from the fakes. Each pack's ace of spade would be stamped to prove authenticity, but they were so easy to copy that the fake packs flooded the market. By 1960, the tax had finally been repealed. Though enforcement was tough, some say the real reason it was quietly dropped is that societal attitudes to gambling had changed. It just goes to show that citizens will also find loopholes when the government is imposing ridiculous taxes. Unfortunately, sometimes it's to their detriment. Like in 1696, when Richard III was so broke that he issued a dedicated window tax. The people were so against it that they simply got rid of their windows. The logic was that the more windows you have, the bigger your house is, and the bigger your house is, the more it cost. But they didn't directly tax income because that was hard to track. So a tangible asset like an estate was easy. You can still see examples on old buildings throughout London where the window sills have been completely bricked up. And to think this tax existed until 1850. People lost sunlight and ventilation, which led to health problems. The poorest were hit the hardest. Their loss of sunlight and ventilation hit them harder, which is where the phrase daylight robbery is said to come from. Although the earliest print of that phrase occurred in 1863, waiting over 100 years to type up a common phrase suggests it's got nothing to do with Richard III's money problems. The moral is that if you're flat broke, don't make things worse for yourself by taking away people's necessities, like soap. While the window tax was in effect, the British monarchy decided that because soap existed in every house, it must therefore be essential, and thus subject to tax. You can guess what the result was: filth and stench, disease and sickness, for 150 years. 2 years after the window tax was repealed, the state decided that it was time everyone took a bath. It had been a tough period for clean freaks. Prices tripled, making it a luxury item. So if you smelled good, you were either rich or buying soap from the black market. Some soap manufacturers had fled abroad, where they could produce it without being taxed. Had they stayed, their equipment and materials would have been kept under lock and key. Regulation was strict. Yet it proved successful for the government, who is said to have raked in nearly £8 billion. That's as much as alcohol duties make. But once the government had made the connection between hygiene and public health, the tax was scrapped. At this point you might be thinking, well, at least governments can't tax you for nature. Think again. Not too long ago, Spain introduced a controversial sunlight tax. Or at least that is how people called it in 2018 because it only affected people who owned solar panels. In the age of green energy, Spain is fortunate to take advantage of the power of the sun. They encouraged homeowners and farmers to add renewable energy sources to their roofs, but this had an unintended consequence. The more people adopted solar energy, the more the electrical grid had to be extended and maintained. So the government levied the costs by taxing your solar panels. People who had more solar panels paid more, but the only way you could have more solar panels is if you had enough to justify their installation. This meant the incentive to switch to green energy was tainted. Some people ditched their solar panel plans completely, which is a big deal in a country that gets great sunshine all year round. Other people found a loophole. They turned to off-grid systems to bypass regulations. By not using the national grid, it meant they didn't have to contribute to its upkeep. Whichever path the person took, the message was clear. What was the point of adopting cleaner, cheaper energy sources if you ended up paying more? Especially when people accused the government of its real motive. They wanted to protect the infrastructure, which makes sense. There is a practical consideration here. If a substantial number of people flock to green energy, it risks affecting those stuck on the old system. In this sense, the levy for maintaining the grid ensured that those who couldn't transition weren't negatively affected. But critics say that's an excuse. The real reason was to protect the utility company's profits from renewable energy users. In their eyes, the government taxing people for going green was really a way to bolster the fossil fuel industry. Whatever the real reason for trying to balance out these two sectors, it didn't last long. Public outcry from environmentalists sparked protests. Add to that pressure from EU environmental policies and the taxes were repealed. Nowadays, some autonomous regions of Spain, like Catalonia, do not need permission to install solar panels. Perhaps things would have been different if Spain got more rain. Over in the US state of Maryland, a rain tax tore the population apart. Some say it was a capricious, unfair way for the authorities to get more money. After all, what kind of person supports being taxed for natural weather events? They argue it was a way to strong-arm residents into adopting eco-friendly ways of life, regardless of whether or not they could afford it. It's all to do with rainwater runoff. Basically, any surface that was impervious, like roofs and driveways, would be taxed to facilitate a stormwater management system. The argument is that rainwater runoff contributes to contaminated municipal water supplies, so those who strain the management systems should levy the costs. But the pushback was huge. Most people did not comply, and those who did added rain gardens to their properties as cheaper alternatives to following state advice. However, even some authorities were against the rain tax. Frederick County set their stormwater fee to just 1% per year. This symbolic gesture was a way to protest because it effectively nullified the financial impact. Other places just refused to go along. Carroll County had a standoff with state authorities over their decision not to go through with it, and in the end, it was the state that backed down. Eventually, the tax was modified rather than flat out repealed, yet there are some who say the claim of a rain tax is an exaggeration. They say it was only ever imposed on the 10 most populated areas because there was a direct correlation with polluted water. And, they say, it's mandated by the Federal Clean Water Act. Fees like this are common throughout the continent. Still, it shows that even if something like the weather can be used to extract more money from you, it shouldn't be a surprise when they tax food. India is currently dealing with a tax on cooking oil. On the 14th of September 2024, the basic customs duty on crude edible oil shot up from 0% to 20%. Now, it's sitting at around 35.75%. The sudden tax increase was to boost local production because oilseed prices had fallen below the minimum support price fixed by the government. But this handbrake turn into supporting local production has burdened farmers and consumers with covering the costs. 70% of edible oils are imported to India. So even if everyone wanted to shop locally, there simply isn't enough to go around. It's too early to tell how the people will react and whether they'll be finding ways around the costs. But given how India is determined to become a formidable economic powerhouse, it's likely they won't be encumbered to reduce the country's demand on the global edible oil markets. If things go smoothly, the defenders say, this should help stabilise the market, but you don't have to look far in history to find a time where hungry people turned on their leaders. In 1381, British peasants were sick and tired of the poll taxes used to fund wars and the government's expenses, especially when every adult was expected to pay the same amount of tax, regardless of whether or not you were a toiling farmer or a comfortable lord. So one day, when a taxman came to visit, the poor, hungry peasants turned on him. The bruised taxman managed to make it back to London, but his clerks and local jurors never left the village alive. But before you think that standing up for yourself is enough to overturn a strange tax, it's time you learnt about the strangest tax of all: bravery. Known as the coward's tax, it is one of the oldest known to historians, as it dates back to 1100 during the reign of King Henry I. During the medieval period, society was run by making sure you knew people who were ready to fight on your behalf. Land and property was a perfect payment for loyalty. However, if you failed to prove your loyalty when a battle broke out, you'd have to pay a tax. If you couldn't afford to pay, then you were dragged to settle some lord's disputes. But if you had the coin, then you could live the life of a knight without lifting a sword. Don't think this tax didn't exist in peaceful times either. By the time the 13th century arrived, the monarchy had realised the tax was better at raising money for the crown than it was about military service. Over time, it evolved into a more general tax, which was a more stable way for the monarchy to secure a revenue source. However, by the 14th century, it was obsolete because feudal military obligations had been replaced by professional armies. But it wasn't long until the government had created new taxes. So the question remains, are the strangest taxes behind us, or are we paying for the same things in different ways? If you liked this video, be sure to check out our one on the history of real estate to learn about how the government is finding another way to get more money out of you. And be sure to subscribe to keep learning how history works.